They took everything from her. Or at least that's what the town believed. The sound came first, fabric tearing in the dry afternoon air, sharp as a branch snapping under boot, followed by a ripple of laughter that didn't belong to any one person but to all of them together, a low, satisfied murmur that rolled across the dusty street like wind through dead grass. And in the center of it stood the Apache woman, barefoot on splintered wood, shoulders straight, chin neither raised nor lowered, as if the heat pressing down from the open sky meant more to her than the eyes surrounding her. And maybe it did, because those eyes were not seeing a person, not really. They were seeing something easier to name, easier to dismiss, easier to take from, piece by piece, until nothing remained that reminded them of themselves. And still she didn't move, not when a man stepped forward to inspect what little she held close, not when another voice called out something half-joking and half-cruel, not when a boy no older than 12 leaned from the edge of the crowd trying to understand what kind of lesson this was supposed to be, because out here lessons were always being taught, just rarely the right ones. And somewhere beyond the ring of bodies a horse shifted, leather creaking, a quiet sound that didn't belong to the rhythm of the crowd, didn't match the laughter or the muttered justifications passed between neighbors who would later swear they had only been watching, only standing by, only doing what anyone else would do in a place where fear traveled faster than truth and settled deeper than either. And the woman, Nayeli, though no one here used her name, held something small against her side, hidden beneath what remained of her clothing, fingers curled tight around it like it was the only thing left that couldn't be taken. And maybe it was, because when a hand reached too close she shifted, just slightly, just enough to say no without speaking. And that small movement carried more weight than anything the crowd had done so far. It wasn't defiance. The way they understood it, loud and reckless and begging for punishment, it was quieter than that, steadier, like a line drawn in the dust that didn't need to be seen to be real. And that was when the laughter thinned, just for a second, because even in a place like this people could feel the difference between someone who had lost everything and someone who had chosen what not to lose, and they didn't like that feeling, didn't like what it suggested about the balance of things, about who was truly in control. So someone spoke louder, pushed the moment forward again, filled the silence before it could settle into something dangerous, something reflective, and the crowd followed, as crowds do, because it is easier to move than to stop, easier to take than to ask why. And through it all the sun hung overhead, indifferent, bleaching the color from the world until dust and skin and would all looked the same shade of tired. And still the woman stood there, not shrinking, not breaking, not giving them what they expected. And that was the part none of them would remember later, not clearly, not honestly, because it would be easier to say she had been weak, easier to say she had deserved it, easier to forget the way she held herself when there was nothing left to hold, except for that one small thing pressed against her ribs, and whatever it meant to carry it this far without letting go. No one asked her name, and that was the first thing Ethan Cole noticed as he watched from the edge of the street, one boot still in the stirrup, the other resting lightly in the dust, as if he had not yet decided whether to stay or turn his horse around and leave this place to its own habits, because towns like this had habits the way men had scars, old, settled, and rarely questioned. And the absence of her name in their mouths told him more than anything they were saying out loud. It told him she had already been decided, already reduced to something that did not require understanding, only handling, only judgment passed between strangers who had never walked a mile beyond their own fences. And he let his gaze settle on her without hurry, taking in the details the others seemed blind to, the steady rise and fall of her breathing despite the tension in the air, the way her feet were planted not in fear but in balance, weight distributed like someone who understood the ground beneath her better than anyone standing around her. And then there was her face, not lowered in defeat, not lifted in challenge, but held in that quiet middle place where a person chooses not to give anything away. And Ethan had seen that look before, on men who had survived things they did not talk about, on women who had buried more than they ever shared. It was not weakness, it was control, and it did not belong in the story the crowd was telling, which made him listen closer, not to the loud voices, but to the smaller ones, the half-finished sentences, the contradictions slipping through when people tried too hard to sound certain. Someone claimed she had been caught taking supplies, Another insisted she had been seen near the edge of town at dawn. A third said nothing at all, but nodded along like agreement was safer than truth. And none of it lined up clean. None of it carried the weight of something real, just the shape of something convenient. And Ethan felt that familiar pull in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but the slow tightening that came when a man realized he was watching something unfold that would not sit right with him later, something that would follow him long after he rode away if he chose to do nothing now. And still he did not move, not immediately, because moving too soon in a place like this could turn the wrong kind of attention in the wrong direction, and he needed to understand what held the center together before he stepped into it. So he watched her hands instead, watched the way they stayed close to her side, not defensive, not reaching out, but guarding something small, something hidden from view. And when one of the townsmen tried to reach toward it, she shifted again, just that slight movement, enough to say there was a line there, enough to show that whatever she carried mattered more than the stairs, more than the voices, more than the heat pressing down from above. And that was when Ethan noticed the dust on her fingers, darker than the ground around them, mixed with something that looked like crushed leaves, the kind you only found miles from any road, up in the hills where people who knew the land went when they needed something the town could not provide. And the pieces began to settle into a different picture, not the one being spoken, but one that felt quieter, truer, and far more dangerous to ignore. Because if she had come from out there, if she had walked that far carrying whatever it was she refused to let go, then this was not about taking, not the way they were claiming. This was about something else entirely, something the town had already decided it did not want to see. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the leather of his saddle creaking as his weight shifted just enough to signal a decision forming. Because out here, a man could ride past a lot of things and call it survival. But there were moments when riding past meant leaving behind something he would not get back. And this, he realized, was one of them. The story the town told itself began long before she ever stepped onto that street. And it grew the way dry weeds grow along a fence line, fast, tangled, and feeding on whatever it could reach. Because a week earlier a supply wagon had come through lighter than it should have been, crates missing, inventory off by just enough to make men uneasy, but not enough to prove anything. And uneasiness in a place like this never stayed quiet for long. It needed a shape, a direction, a name it could point toward, and when none appeared on its own, they made one, piece by piece, until it fit the fear they already carried. And someone had said they saw a figure near the outskirts at dawn, moving where no one from town had reason to be, and someone else added that it had been an Apache woman, alone, which was enough to turn suspicion into certainty in the span of a single conversation, because certainty did not require evidence here. It only required agreement, and agreement came easy when it protected the rest from looking too closely at their own mistakes, at the unlocked doors, the miscounted supplies, the quiet truth that things went missing sometimes without any outsider's help at all. And now that certainty stood in the center of the street wearing her face, carrying her silence, absorbing their words without returning them, and Ethan could see how comfortable it made them, how steady their voices became when they spoke about her, as if the conclusion had always been obvious, as if this moment had been waiting for her to arrive so it could finally make sense. And yet the details still refused to settle, like dust that would not quite lie flat. Because if she had taken something, if she had come into town for that purpose, she would not still be here, not standing in plain sight, not holding on to whatever small thing rested against her side, as if it mattered more than escape, more than safety, more than anything they were accusing her of wanting. And the contradiction hung there, quiet but undeniable, brushing against the edges of the story they were telling. And each time it did, someone spoke louder to cover it, to smooth it over with another claim, another half-truth dressed up as fact, until the noise itself became proof, until the weight of their voices replaced the need for anything real. And through it all Nayeli said nothing, not a single word to defend herself, not a plea, not a denial, not even a question, and that silence unsettled Ethan more than any argument could have, because silence like that was not empty. It was chosen. It was held the way she held that hidden object, carefully, deliberately, as if breaking it would cost more than anything already taken from her. And he wondered then what she had heard before this moment, what had been said to her in the hours leading up to this. whether she had been given a chance to speak and refused it, or whether the chance had never existed at all, and the answer did not seem to matter to the people around her, because their need had already been filled, their uncertainty replaced with something solid they could point at, something they could stand against together without ever turning inward. And Ethan felt the balance shift again, subtle but certain, the kind of shift that happens when a man stops observing and starts deciding, when the line between watching and acting becomes too thin to ignore, and his fingers tightened slightly on the saddle horn as he drew a slow breath, tasting dust and heat and something else beneath it, something older, something that did not belong to the town or its story but to the land itself, the same land that had taught people like her how to endure without explanation, how to carry what mattered and leave the rest behind. And in that moment, the story the town had built began to feel smaller, thinner, like something that would not hold if tested. And Ethan knew then that what happened next would not depend on what was true, but on who was willing to stand where truth had been pushed aside. It happened in a moment so small most of them would later swear it had not been the turning point. Just another movement in a long chain of movements. Just another man stepping too close. Just another attempt to prove something that did not need proving. But Ethan saw it clearly, the way the man reached again, slower this time. Not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, like he had decided that whatever line had been there before no longer mattered. And the crowd leaned in with him, not physically, not all at once, but in that subtle way people do when they expect something final, something that would settle the tension and give them a clean ending to the story they had already accepted. And for the first time, Nayeli moved more than a fraction, not stepping back, not turning away, but shifting her weight forward just enough to meet the motion instead of avoiding it, her hand tightening over what she held, her shoulders aligning as if she were bracing against something unseen. And there was no fear in it, not the kind the town understood, not the kind that asked for mercy or looked for escape. It was something steadier, something that said this far and no further without needing words. And that was when the air changed, not with sound but with absence, because the laughter did not come this time. The easy noise that had filled the street faltered, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain, as if even they could feel that they were approaching a place they had not planned for, a place where the outcome might not match the story they had built. And the man hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for the moment to stretch, for the heat to press down harder, for the dust to settle around their boots in a silence that felt heavier than any shout. And Ethan felt it then, the exact point where watching became choosing, where distance became involvement whether he stepped forward or not. Because there are moments that do not allow a man to remain outside them, moments that reach out and take hold whether he wants them to or not. And this was one of them. He could feel it in the way his horse stilled beneath him, in the way his breath slowed without him telling it to, in the way his hand left the saddle without any clear command, just instinct, just something older than thought guiding the movement. And he stepped down fully into the street, boots settling into the dust with a sound that was not loud but carried farther than it should have, cutting across the space between the edges of the crowd and the center where she stood, and a few heads turned, then more, the ripple moving outward as people noticed something had shifted, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to pull their attention away from the woman they had been focused on and toward the man who had not been part of the story until now. And Ethan did not rush, did not push his way through. He walked at the same steady pace he would use, crossing an open field, unhurried, unannounced, as if he had every right to be there and no need to explain it. And that alone was enough to create space, small at first, then wider, as bodies shifted without fully understanding why, as voices quieted without being told. And when he reached the edge of that invisible circle, he stopped, not beside her, not in front of her, but close enough that the line between them and him no longer felt separate. And he looked not at the man who had reached, not at the sheriff who had said nothing, but at the woman herself, meeting her gaze without intrusion, without question, just recognition, as if acknowledging something the others had refused to see. And then, only then, he spoke, his voice low, even, carrying just enough to reach the ones who needed to hear it without turning into a spectacle. And he said, "That is enough." Not loud, not forceful, but final in a way that did not ask for agreement, did not invite argument, just placed a boundary where there had been none. And for a moment no one answered. because the kind of certainty they had built did not know how to respond to something so simple, so steady, so unwilling to bend into their version of events. And in that silence, something began to unravel, not quickly, not completely, but enough to show the edges of what had always been fragile beneath the noise. The words did not echo, they did not demand attention, yet they settled over the street with a weight that no one had prepared for. And the man who had stepped forward first let his hand fall back to his side, as if it had suddenly lost its purpose. Not because he agreed, not because he understood, but because something in the way those words were spoken left no space to continue as he had been, and the crowd felt it too. That subtle shift where momentum falters, and no one is quite sure who should move next. And in that pause, Ethan did not look around for approval, did not measure the reaction. He simply reached up and unbuttoned his coat, slow, deliberate, each motion clear enough that no one could mistake it for hesitation. And the fabric slid free from his shoulders with the soft sound of worn leather bending to a new shape. And he stepped forward that final half step, closing the distance that had separated observer from action. And without a word, he held the coat out, not draping it without consent, not forcing it into place, just offering it in the open space between them as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, as if nothing else in that moment needed explaining. And for the first time, Nayeli's gaze shifted, not away, not down, but toward him, meeting his eyes directly, measuring him in the same quiet way she had measured the ground beneath her feet. And whatever she saw there did not change her expression, but it changed something in the stillness between them, something that allowed her hand to release its grip just enough for one arm to move, to accept what was given without surrendering what she had held onto from the beginning. And the coat settled around her shoulders, heavy, plain, carrying the dust of miles and the faint scent of sun-warmed leather. And Ethan stepped back immediately, not lingering, not claiming the gesture, leaving space where respect could exist without being spoken. And then he said it, just as simply as before. I will take you home, not as a question, not as a promise made for show, but as a statement placed carefully into the air between them. And the words carried differently than anything else that had been said that day. They did not accuse, did not defend, did not explain. They simply pointed forward, beyond the street, beyond the gathered eyes, towards something the town had not considered. And for a moment no one answered, not the man who had reached, not the others who had spoken so freely before, not even the sheriff who stood with his hand resting where authority should have been. Because to answer would mean stepping into something they did not control, something that did not follow the path they had laid out. And Ethan did not wait for permission, did not ask for it. He turned slightly, just enough to signal movement without forcing it, trusting that the choice now belonged to her, not to them. And behind him the crowd remained where it was, held in place not by fear but by uncertainty, the kind that comes when a story begins to slip out of their hands, when the ending they expected no longer feels certain. And in that silence, broken only by the faint shifting of boots against dry ground, the weight of what had just happened settled in, quiet, undeniable, and far heavier than anything they had tried to take. For a few long seconds nothing moved, not the men, not the dust, not even the restless shifting that usually followed any break in tension. And then a voice came from somewhere behind Ethan, sharper than before, trying to pull the moment back into something familiar, something controlled. You just going to walk her out like nothing happened. And it carried that forced confidence people use when they feel something slipping away. And Ethan did not turn right away, did not rush to answer. Because answers given too quickly in places like this only fed the noise, and he had no interest in feeding anything they had built. So he let the silence stretch just enough to remind them it still belonged to him now, not to the crowd. And when he did speak, his voice stayed level, almost quiet. Looks that way. And that was all. No explanation, no defense, just a statement that did not bend to meet their expectations. And that unsettled them more than any argument would have, because arguments could be answered, pushed against, turned into something louder. But this calm refusal to participate in their version of events left them with nothing to grab onto. And a few of them shifted their weight, boots scraping lightly against the ground, glances passing between faces that had been so certain just moments before. And the sheriff cleared his throat like he might step in, like he might reclaim the authority he had let slip. But the sound faded before it became anything, swallowed by the same uncertainty that had taken hold of the rest, and Ethan could feel it behind him. The way attention followed every movement now, not with the same hunger as before, but with something quieter, something closer to doubt. And beside him, Nayeli adjusted the coat slightly, not pulling it tighter, not hiding within it, but settling it in place as if it belonged there, as if dignity could be returned in small measures and still carry its full weight. And her hand found its way back to the object at her side, fingers resting over it with that same careful intention, and Ethan noticed how her breathing had not changed, not rushed, not uneven, just steady, the way it had been from the beginning. And that steadiness did more to quiet the space around them than anything else could have, because it refused to match the tension the town had tried to create, refused to reflect it back. And without that reflection, the tension had nowhere to go, nowhere to grow. It simply thinned, stretched out into something fragile, something that could not hold if pressed any further. And one of the men took a half step forward as if to test it, then stopped, eyes flicking from Ethan to the woman and back again, calculating something that did not add up the way it had before. And finally he said it, softer than he intended. "She does not belong here." And Ethan gave the smallest nod, not agreement, not approval, just acknowledgement. "That is right," he said. And then after a brief pause, "So we are leaving." And the words settled differently this time, not as a challenge, not as a threat, but as a conclusion already reached. And there was no one there who could find a reason strong enough to stand against it, not without stepping into a place they no longer seemed certain they owned. And that was the shift, the quiet turning of something unseen, where control slipped from the many to the few, not through force, not through noise, but through the simple act of someone refusing to follow the path laid out for him. And in that moment the town, for all its voices, for all its certainty, found itself without direction, watching as the story it had built walked slowly out of its grasp. They did not hurry, and that was the part that made it real, not a retreat, not an escape, but a choice made in full view of everyone who had expected something louder, something final. And instead they watched two figures begin to move through the same space that had held them still just moments before. Ethan taking the first step without looking back, not out of disregard, but because looking back would have given the moment more weight than it needed. And Nayeli followed at her own pace, not close enough to suggest dependence, not far enough to suggest distance. Just beside the path he had opened, her steps light but certain against the packed dirt, and the coat shifted with her movement, catching the sunlight in dull folds that softened the harsh outline the crowd had tried to carve around her. And as they passed through the edge of the gathered bodies, no one reached out, no one stepped in front of them, not because they could not, but because something unspoken had settled into place, something that made action feel misplaced, unnecessary, even wrong. And the people who had filled the space so easily before now found themselves moving aside, without quite knowing why, creating a passage that had not existed until it was needed. And the sounds of the town began to return in small pieces, a door creaking somewhere down the street, a horse shifting its weight against a hitching post, the faint clink of metal from a far corner where someone had forgotten to stay still. And yet none of it broke the quiet that traveled with them, a quiet that did not come from absence but from presence, from the simple fact that something had changed and no one had the words to name it yet. And as they walked, Ethan kept his pace steady, not slowing to match her, not quickening to lead, just maintaining a rhythm that allowed her to choose her own. And after a few steps she spoke, her voice low, measured, carrying the weight of someone who did not spend words lightly. "You do not know where that is." And Ethan gave a small breath that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it never fully formed. "No," he said, "but I know it is not here." And that was enough. Not an answer, not a plan, just a direction that did not rely on certainty. And she seemed to accept that in the same way she had accepted the coat, without question, without gratitude spoken aloud, just a quiet recognition that something had been given without being taken. And the town fell behind them inch by inch, the edges of it softening into the open stretch beyond, where the ground rolled out in long, dry lines, and the horizon held steady in the distance like a promise that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And when they reached the far end of the street, Ethan paused just long enough to reach for the reins of his horse, the animal lifting its head as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. And he did not mount immediately, did not rush the next step. Instead, he glanced toward her again, not asking, not directing, just leaving the space open. And for the first time since they had begun to move, she shifted her grip on the small object at her side, drawing it out just enough for him to see the edge of it, a small pouch, worn, carefully tied, carrying the faint scent of crushed herbs that did not belong to any place near the town. And she held it not like something stolen, but like something entrusted, something that mattered beyond her own presence in that moment. And Ethan nodded once, not in understanding but in acknowledgement, because sometimes that was all a person could offer, and sometimes it was enough to carry them forward. The road opened ahead of them in a long stretch of pale earth and scattered stone, the kind that held heat long after the sun had passed its peak. And for a while neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because what needed saying did not belong to the kind of words most people used. And Ethan walked beside his horse, reins loose in his hand, matching her pace without drawing attention to it, letting the distance from the town settle into something real, something that could not be undone by a second glance or a shouted call from behind. And after a time Nayeli slowed, just slightly, enough to mark a change, and she turned her head toward the hills rising in the distance, low and blue against the horizon. And when she spoke, again her voice carried that same quiet steadiness, but now there was something else beneath it, something closer to purpose. 3 miles north of the dry creek, she said, there are people waiting. And Ethan nodded once, eyes following the line she indicated, measuring the land the way a man does when he knows he will have to cross it, not quickly, not carelessly, but with the kind of attention that keeps small things from becoming larger problems. And he said, then we should not waste the daylight. And they continued on, the rhythm of their steps falling into something shared without being spoken. And after a few minutes she loosened her hold on the pouch just enough to untie the cord, careful, deliberate, as if the act itself carried weight beyond the simple motion. And she opened it slightly, just enough for him to see inside without exposing it fully. Dried leaves, roots, small wrapped bundles tied with thread the color of earth and ash, each one placed with intention, each one carrying the faint, sharp scent of something bitter and necessary. And she said, fever took hold 2 nights ago. Not looking at him, not asking for sympathy, just placing the truth where it belonged. Children first, then the elders. And Ethan felt the pieces settle into place with a clarity the town had refused. The missing supplies, the timing, the direction she had come from. All of it shifting from accusation into something far simpler, far harder to ignore. And he asked, not out of doubt but to hear it spoken, you came alone. And she gave the smallest nod. Faster that way, she said. And then after a pause that held more than the words themselves, less likely to bring trouble back with me. And Ethan let out a slow breath, not quite a sigh, more a release of something that had been tightening since the moment he saw her standing in that street. And he glanced back once, not toward the town itself, which had already faded into distance, but toward the direction it lay, as if measuring how far ignorance could travel compared to necessity. And then he looked forward again, because forward was the only direction that mattered now, and the land stretched out ahead, dry but honest, offering no judgment, no false stories, just distance to be covered in time that could not be wasted. And after another stretch of quiet she added, almost as if the thought had been waiting for the right moment to be spoken, if it is not delivered before nightfall, some will not see morning. And the words did not carry fear, did not plead, they simply stated what was, and that was enough, more than enough, because truth like that did not need decoration, did not need to be raised or lowered to make its point. It stood on its own, clear and unyielding. And Ethan adjusted his grip on the reins, his pace shifting just slightly, not rushing, not breaking into urgency that would cost them later, but tightening the rhythm in a way that spoke of understanding. And without another word they moved forward together, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two people carrying something that mattered beyond themselves, something that had already begun to reshape the meaning of everything left behind. They reached the rise just as the light began to lean toward evening, the sun lowering enough to stretch long shadows across the dry ground. And from that higher point the land opened wide in front of them, revealing the shallow cut of the dry creek, and, beyond it, movement that did not belong to wind or wandering animals. Shapes gathered close, still but watchful, and Ethan slowed without needing to be told, sensing the shift before the details came into focus, and Nayeli stepped ahead by half. A pace, not to lead but to be seen first, her presence carrying meaning he could not claim, and as they descended the last stretch the figures became clearer, men and women standing in quiet formation, not advancing, not retreating, simply waiting with a patience that spoke of both concern and discipline, and when they were close enough the first of them stepped forward, an older man with lines worn deep by sun and years, his gaze moving not to Ethan but to Nayeli, searching, measuring, and then settling when he saw what he needed to see, and she lifted the pouch slightly, not in display but in confirmation, and a breath seemed to move through the group, not relief spoken aloud, but something quieter, heavier, the kind that comes when time has nearly run out and then does not. And without ceremony, she placed the pouch into the elder's hands, her fingers lingering just long enough to ensure the weight had transferred. And then she stepped back, not claiming credit, not waiting for acknowledgement, simply returning to stillness as the others moved with purpose, carrying what had been brought to where it was needed most. And Ethan remained where he was, holding the reins loosely, watching without stepping into a space that was not his. And after a moment the elder turned his attention to him, not with suspicion, not with gratitude spoken in grand terms, but with a steady look that held understanding without requiring explanation, and he inclined his head once, a gesture small enough to miss if a man was not paying attention, and Ethan returned it in kind, because some things did not need to be translated into words to be clear, and the light continued to fade, softening the edges of everything it touched, turning dust into gold and shadows into something almost gentle. And for a while there was only the quiet movement of people doing what needed to be done, no noise, no spectacle, just the steady rhythm of care replacing the tension that had filled the day. And when it was finished, Nayeli stepped back toward Ethan, the coat still resting on her shoulders, and she paused, just long enough to meet his eyes again, not searching this time, not measuring, but acknowledging, and she said, "You brought me where I needed to be." And he gave a slight shake of his head, not dismissing the words, but setting them in their proper place. "You were already going there," he said, and she considered that for a moment, then nodded once, accepting it as she had accepted everything else, without excess, without need for more. And as the first stars began to show in the darkening sky, he turned his horse back toward the open land, not waiting for anything else, not expecting it, and rode away at the same steady pace he had walked in, leaving behind no claim, no demand, only the quiet space where something had been set right without ever being forced. And miles away the town would settle into its evening as it always did, doors closing, lamps lighting, voices lowering into the familiar patterns of routine. But something would remain unsettled beneath it all, something that would not quite fit back into the shape it had held before, because out here, sometimes the loudest kind of justice did not come with raised voices or drawn lines. It came in the form of a man who chose to stand still when others moved, and then chose to move when others could not, and left without needing to say anything more.